All right, welcome everyone. Our guest is Izzy Carnwath. She's a communication and management consultant in international sport and business. Hello, Izzy. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. Yeah, beautiful sunny day here in the UK, and they've stopped chopping down trees outside. The ambulances have stopped, so hopefully we get some quiet time for an interview now.
Right on, right on. I'm looking forward to this. I have some questions for you in regards to communications marketing as it pertains to combat sports. Let's dive right into it. My first question for you is, as a communication consultant with a focus on combat sports, what unique challenges and opportunities do you believe this sector offers compared to other sporting genres?
I think that the growth of MMA has just been absolutely phenomenal, and that's not been lost on anybody, from the birth of the UFC onwards. And the market just seems to just carry on growing. You see all the new promotions moving in, and that huge appetite for sports content, whether that's on social media, OTT, across your Netflix channels, and so on. So that's really, really exciting. I think what's been really fascinating working with IMAF as well is seeing that whole group growth at the grassroots end. So what's particular about mixed martial arts is, unlike sports like cricket, football, tennis, your traditional sports that grew over decades, centuries even, and then made it onto commercial platforms, onto broadcast and so on. MMA through the UFC was brought onto a commercial platform first at the pro end, and it spawned copycat movements all around the world, as it were. Obviously, you've had Pride and other movements from different regions, but UFC's really spearheaded that in a big way. And what IMAF tried to do coming in, I guess 20 years on, was to go backwards and build up the grassroots that didn't exist. So even though there were gyms and there's been promotions everywhere, there's not really been those structures in place. There's not been the safeguarding, the talent pathways, all that traditional stuff that you have in other well-structured and governed sports. So what's been particularly interesting is going into completely new markets now, where the sports at a very, very developmental stage, and IMAF's been able to go in with that package, and through our championships platform and through coaching and development and so on, really accelerate the growth in those regions. So yeah, from grassroots right up to the commercial level, it's just rapidly moving, I'd say.
So, Izzy, you're currently working with Hexagon MMA, a French promotion that is gaining recognition. For North American fans who might not be familiar with it, could you share some reasons as to why they should tune in? What makes Hexagon MMA unique? What exciting elements can fans expect when they watch these events?
I think one of the most exciting things about Hexagon MMA is that it's a French homegrown promotion, and the sport was banned in France until 2020. So there's a real appetite for it there. Previously, fighters had to fight abroad. They couldn't fight at home. So among the roster, Hexagon's bringing back some pioneering French names, some veterans. You've got some guys in their 40s, people who've been away for a little bit, people who are known on the international circuit but could never fight at home before. You've got Greg MMA, Anthony Rea, Anthony Dizzy as well. And as well as that, they've got some really hot prospects you see coming out of Europe. They had Chanel Dyer recently, had absolutely stunning first round spinning elbow knockout, which was phenomenal. Did the rounds on social. Mehdi Ben Lakhdar is exciting. And then the international names, veterans, and unusual people who've taken perhaps unconventional career paths, but are really kind of bona fide talent and known at the grassroots. So people like Dean Garnett, he's Mohammed Mokaev's coach, he's making a comeback as well. So it's a different kind of mix of talent than you'd see on UFC, for example, but putting international names against upcoming French national talent, and high production values. They a TV production company first with fighting spirit, and it's a beautiful iconic location. So they're going to have an event coming up at the ancient theatre of Orange, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's an open air Roman amphitheatre, and also an ancient bullfighting ring known as the French Seville. So it's got a unique flavour and feel to it, most definitely, and packing out arenas around the French provinces, and also events abroad as well. So they're looking to increase that footprint, going out on DAZN internationally and on platforms such as BT Sport. So it's an entertaining event, and a lot of fighters with good backstories, some really good narrative hooks in there as well.
Very interesting. If I may ask, just a follow up in regards to MMA in France, can you speak to kind of give us a brief overview as to how MMA became legal in France?
Yes, so I mean, I've actually played a big part in that. There are many stakeholders in France, different groups. There's Bertrand Moussu, who is one of the board members of IMAF. He was pivotal in that movement. But it was a long lobby. And eventually, what happened was the government was persuaded that MMA didn't need to be recognised and needed to be governed, that it was safer to do that than it remaining as an underground movement, as it were. And following a consultation, they decided to put French boxing in charge of establishing the National Federation in France. So France is quite interesting because every sport has to be under a government recognised authority. You can't just go in and set up a sport, as it were. So French boxing now has that mandate, and the sport is really, really thriving there now. It's really growing, but it's been a really interesting journey.
I bet, and I think it's very interesting to see that country, fully acknowledge the sport of MMA because they produce so many great combat sports athletes in other amateur and professional sports. So it's fantastic for sports fans, MMA fans worldwide. Moving on to the next question here in regards to content. How has the global market for combat sports content evolved over the last decade? And where do you see it heading in the next 5 to 10 years? I know this is a big question, but I'm really curious to know what your thoughts are on this.
Well, I think with the general sporting landscape, there's been a major shift, as everybody's seen, over to OTT, to mobile devices, to social media, to shorter form content. And that's just continuing to grow in that direction. It's become a lot more fragmented landscape as well. And a lot more interest in the athletes of backstories, the behind the scenes, the individualized stories, more individualized content, and so on. So I'd say that would be the major shift. And with AI as well now, that's going to just accelerate that process. And also the capacity for rights holders to deliver increasingly segmented and individualized content across platforms to different groups of fans.
Really interesting. It leads well to my next question. With the growing role of big data and analytics in sports, how do you see these trends impacting communications and PR strategies in the world of combat sports?
The more data we're able to gather, then I know that obviously the more information we have about who's consuming the content, how they're consuming it, where they're consuming it, what type of content they prefer, and with all the interaction that you can now have through social media and so on, then your fans can really kind of organically, in terms of the data we pull in, direct the way we drive the narrative, the way we drive our strategies, how we decide to deliver what we're doing. Just certainly again the whole progress of AI, augmented reality, all these different kind of areas. It's allowing increasingly creative solutions as well. Right through from the practical production side, through to the editing, delivery, and so on.
Right on. It seems like the data feeds a lot into the awareness of different audiences, different profiles, what works and what doesn't. With that being said, from your previous experience as Director of Communication and Brand for IMAF, could you share some examples of successful public relations campaigns you've executed? What made them so impactful?
I think what's interesting with IMAF is that essentially on the PR side, it was very much a lobbying organisation. So the broader campaign is to see the sport recognised and regulated globally and to get that Olympic recognition. So we've had many different PR and social media campaigns over time, but it's all fed into that bigger lobbying drive. So I think like many political campaigns, you look at Brexit, you look at some big oil campaigns over time and so on. A lot of these can sort of take a decade or so really to gain momentum. So you're really in it for the long haul. So like major wins for IMAF would have been the recognition and acceptance of MMA in France finally, and that wasn't just IMAF, that was alongside a lot of other different stakeholders. And when we managed to about turn the pressure for a ban on the sport in Ireland, for example, the fact we've obtained or had obtained government recognition in over sort of 50% of our member countries, that those are the major wins, and all the messaging and the values that we narrate across, whether it's sort of PR, social, public affairs, broadcast, and so on, all push in that direction. So I think there's been huge successes there, which will only continue to be built on and to grow.
I know you mentioned AI earlier on. I just want to follow up on that. In the rapidly evolving digital landscape, how have you leveraged new technologies such as AI to enhance the reach and impact of your communication efforts?
I think at this time AI is really embedded into a lot of the softwares that we're using already and will continue to be developed. And also the main way I'd say in comms is through different plugins to, again, software we're already using. The big drive is going to obviously be in areas such as being able to generate content faster and with less manpower. So they're predicting about 90% of content writing will be AI driven very soon, and this also cuts across areas of production, editing, broadcast, graphic creation, and so on. I think from a sports management point of view, it is really going to be market driven like everything else, and it'll follow those same decision making processes. So as we decide which softwares we're going to use or buy in or so on, it's really about what's going to be efficient, what's going to do the job, what's going to do it well, add more creative options, keep up with the competitors, is it an affordable entry point, and so on. But I think the really more fascinating piece as well in management are the broad organisational decisions and planning, and the way we're really going to have to keep our eye on the broader business and governance landscape. So, whether it's to do with human resources, training, talent funnels through businesses. So the type of training you're going to need to give staff in comms, whether it's to manage or prompt AI, or which roles are better driven by human minds, or what's going to be better carried out by machines, or even on the ethics side, I would say, right. To a big degree in sport, particularly where you have ethics committees and so on. There's going to be a lot to take on board. I know in comms, there's a lot being asked about. I know how do you manage misinformation, for example, because that can move extremely fast, and it's going to move faster than before. It's going to be harder to detect, and what's the responsibility of content creators in that space? That's a big one. In marketing, there's bigger kind of questions as well, deeper questions about the kind of interception into human free will, and so I think it's going to be an interesting space, because where governments decide to regulate, where business sectors decide to regulate, and actually having to keep abreast of all these different moving parts are going to be, the responsibility of business leaders, and in sports particularly, where there's a big push on ethics.
Yeah, it's a big issue, and it's interesting how it's going to impact all of these different streams from communications, marketing, ethics, as you said. It's a fascinating topic. Moving on now to my next question, in regards, like, working communications for combat sports like MMA often means seeing the sport from a unique behind the scenes perspective. How has this experience changed your view of the sport? Has it altered your understanding or appreciations of what athletes go through?
I came into the sport from a gym side to begin with, because I wanted to learn self-defense. So I heard that there was a cage fighting gym around my corner. This is how long ago it was. And I figured out that the guys would know how to defend themselves. So I went down and started training. So the first fights I actually saw were interclub. fights in the gym where everybody's standing around the cage and your fingers are kind of pressed through the sides of it, and watching fights like that. So it was never lost on me the athleticism, the commitment, the discipline, the sweat and blood, literally, of athletes training in the gym, and also the whole kind of, I guess, the spiritual journey for a fighter. I think a lot of people feel there's a element of that. So I started there, and it was really through representing fighters that I got into the PR side. And from the beginning in the UK at the time, there was a lot of sensationalist press. The tabloids were talking about cage fighting. There was a lot of, I guess, kind of gangster element being pushed around it, and so on. And so I strongly felt it was being misrepresented. So I was always pushing to get the journalists into the gym, get the journalists training alongside the fighters, and really to see that side of it, and really to promote the sports side, and educating the press that it's mixed martial arts, it's not cage fighting, it is a sport, and so on. So that's something I've always been aligned with.
Do you think public perception has changed in regards to the sport? Do they still see it do tabloids still spin it in that sort of negative way?
Oh, no, I mean, it's massively shifted. I mean, it's certainly in most of Europe now and worldwide, but you'll still get the sensationalist stories that if there's where you'll get a cage fighter robbed a granny on the high street, which might be in the news or soft feature section, but not overall. No, I mean, the MMA makes it into all the sports pages now, and is understood as being a legitimate sport. Whether people like it or not, some people don't like it, some people don't like boxing, but it's still it's really broken through those barriers now, and it's now the Council of Europe actually overturned its recommendation against free fighting. Was it about a year or so ago now? And so it's really gained that credibility over here.
Yeah, and it's everywhere, right? All over, all these channels online and so on. MMA is at least on this side of the Atlantic. It's very popular, as I'm sure it is in Europe and worldwide, as you said. Moving on now to this next question I have here. How do you manage to balance sports governance, company operation, and large-scale event management, particularly in the high-pressure environment of combat sports? Sounds very challenging. What's your approach to work and working on multiple projects/services at once? How do you, I would imagine there's a lot of multitasking and a lot of deadlines. What's your formula to success with all that?
I think having to work across a spread of areas is really symptomatic of being in a sort of startup phase or young company. And it's a necessity to end up wearing a lot of different hats. I think critical to that is having a really solid vision and strategic plan, and really keeping focused on what the critical targets are. And a lot of times you have to move between projects as well. So it's really when something comes to the fore, becomes prevalent, that you really have to dig into the details and really research intensively on that particular project at that time. But I think it's all in the planning and being able to prioritize. It does mean you become a generalist, which can be frustrating when you'd like to perhaps specialize or excel more in particular areas. But I think that's the nature of the beast with any young company, as I say.
Given your background in broadcast licensing, how do you see the rise of streaming services and other digital platforms influencing the distribution of combat sports content?
I think, as we just sort of touched on earlier, really, it's that it's an increasingly segmented audience and market. So it's about being able to deliver across those different platforms in increasingly personalized ways.
As combat sports become more mainstream, how do you work on brand development for athletes and organizations to help them maintain their unique identities while appealing to a broader audience?
I actually think that the mainstream is, in some ways, more open and easier to pitch individual human interest stories too. So that there's always an appetite for a quirky story or a compelling narrative about somebody overcoming, for example, hardship to achieve great success and so on. So I think it's in verse to the question almost. I think that in some ways the MMA media is often harder to break into if you're not one of the biggest promotions, and if you haven't got the partnerships and so on. Whereas the mainstream media is a lot more open, and then that's being shown increasingly as well by the continued growing appetite on sports streaming platforms for the documentaries and the human stories, and the same for social media, wanting to know the behind the scenes and the details of athletes' lives and so on.
Yeah, I love the documentaries and all that additional content in video format and text, like in the form of articles and all that. I think it's outstanding. If I may, I just have a follow-up in regards to the topic. What are your thoughts on how, a lot of these athletes are very digitally savvy? They think about their image, their brand, whatever you want to call it, and they know how to use that to really push their career. I guess what I'm asking, what are your thoughts on how you have this rise of digitally savvy combat sports athletes who know how to use social media to tell their story and to really kind of elevate, I guess, their relevancy within the sea of like hyper competitive, combat sports? Well, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's brilliant. I think it could be an absolute gift, and then that's ultimately what you really want as an organisation or a brand. It's not you just telling your story, but it's your influencers and members and everybody else sort of getting out there and also telling their part in it. So it's great. I think the challenge is twofold. One is if you're trying to kind of coordinate that and harness that and leverage it in any meaningful way, that you don't have such a handle always on it, and also just in terms of messaging that people can go out and say, well, absolutely anything, can't they? It might not always be in line with the messaging that you're wanting to promote. So it's a lot more difficult to control. I think there's also to that point there's a lot more pressure on social media teams, because also everybody's become a self-publisher. Everybody's got more opinions and views, and they're just wanting to see their stories told and reflected, and so on. As much as people are creating content themselves, people are wanting also to see immediate reactions and also sort of immediate telling their stories on the organisation side. So it's a lot to manage, and it's particularly with a small team, and it's very so it's just something that doesn't go to sleep. It's always moving. So it's exciting and creative, and it'll be a huge positive. But it's difficult on the, I guess, issues management or potential crisis side, for example.
Very interesting. If I may, another follow-up. Do you think it's possible, especially on the professional MMA side of things, do you think it's possible for an athlete to gain popularity for, I mean, I'm using the word popularity, but to gain relevance if they say opt out from social media and doing interviews? Like, is that in this climate, is that even possible for someone to be completely not involved in any aspect of communications and marketing? Is that, do you think that's possible?
I think that would be challenging, because you need the commitment of your athletes and your influencers to being available being available for media opportunities. So, like, certainly at least for the content that the organisation's creating and producing and putting out there. And certainly if an athlete doesn't want to manage that themselves, and as they grow, then they might want to have a third party manage that on their behalf. But it's become such an essential part if you want to be a face or name in the market, then I think that's key. I don't think you can avoid it. But and I think the issue becomes increasingly as well that if somebody's not speaking for themselves, they'll be spoken for everywhere as well. It's such a powerful platform to be able to control your own content. So it's I wouldn't say that's recommended.
Now, from a communication perspective, how have you approached the issue of athlete safety and health in combat sport? How important is transparency in these discussions?
It's always been core to my involvement in the sport. I was a founder of Safe MMA, which is the first medical entity for the sport in the UK. It's a charity, and it was formed in the absence of any regulation in the region, and set the first medical standards and also got medical clearance processes for competitors, partners with a lot of shows now, and it was partnered with IMAF previously. And then in IMAF, I was involved in establishing the first medical committee there and progressing the first medical standards for events. How it relates to comms, if you don't have those things in place, then your organisation is always going to be at reputational risk. And I think a lot of comms is really about what you keep out of the public eye, or the issues you mitigate and prevent. I think that's the first pillar before you even start promoting. So it's an essential part. In terms of transparency, I think it's important to be transparent about the standards you have in place, that you're open to inspection and review and improvement and those things, but you always have to be mindful of athlete confidentiality around their own personal medical issues and so on. So within reason. But I think if an organisation isn't transparent about its own processes and governance processes and how it safeguards it's people, then I don't think it's a good look for the organisation.
Izzy, I have one last question for you. As a communication and management consultant specializing in sport, what aspect of your work do you find the most rewarding? And on the flip side, are there any aspects that pose consistent challenges? Could you share what fuels your passion and keeps you inspired in this role?
I've always been an ideas person, so I love being in that space where you're generating, whether it's creative ideas, whether it's business ideas, where you're trying to resolve, I guess, challenges, as it were. So I do love that whole sort of startup phase of a business or new projects and so on. I think that's what's exciting, to be able to see that through and see its growth, working with talented people and teams, being able to share and generate ideas, and the same with networking with partners and being able to innovate. I think that's the exciting side. Challenging side with comms is, as we've touched on, it's such a fast-moving space. It's alive 24/7. With social media, you can't switch that off. So there's a lot of demands and competing demands, I suppose, and that's not just externally, but I think I am interested as well how COVID's probably affected individuals' reliance on social media, and then how that affects demands and dynamics also within organisations. And there's I'd say a lot of pressure, particularly on the social media side.
And if I could just follow up, what keeps you? I think you've answered it, but I'll ask again. What keeps you passionate and inspired about the role?
I mean, I love to have a cause to push for, and I think if you believe in the vision and where the organisation is going, and you're passionate about the project, it overrides everything, overrides all the logistical and day-to-day challenges. So certainly that, and being able to see progress and being able to see ideas come into fruition and grow, and real entities and events and developments to grow out of initial discussions and thoughts on what was written down on a piece of paper. It's exciting to see all of that concepts come to life.
Yeah, I love that as well. It's an awesome process. Now, Izzy, where can we find you online? And if you could plug your website and all that, please.
Yep. So my website is icom.london. It's icom.london. And I'm at Izzy Carnwath, IZZYCARNWATH on Twitter. I am on Instagram as well. And yeah, that's me.
Well, thank you very much for your time. And I've really enjoyed this conversation. I'm probably going to come back to you with another interview down the road, but thank you very much for joining us.
All right, thanks.